everybody. Tonight we're going to be working on section 19 in the tutorial document, and you can see the topic tonight is going to be Razor. So some of this will be a little bit of repeat because we talked about Razor earlier on in the course, and there's not really a lot to do in this particular section in terms of coding. So let's get started. And one thing that we have to remember is the way that we're stitching our pages together here kind of utilizes so many different technologies, and I think that's part of the fun of working with MVC in a .NET format. But really, kind of the grand goal is like what you see here. He's got this little diagram where he talks about how we set up basically a template or a structure for our interface, and then once we marry it with the data that's on the back end, whether it's in a database or a flat file or built right into a class or something, we merge those two things together, and then we end up with the resulting output, which is then pushed out to the client in the browser. So a mix of technologies happens. Straight up HTML, you have C# code working on the back end, which can help to generate content and push into the data portion of it. And then you also have this special language called Razor. And really what Razor is, they call it a view engine because it's really designed to do output and give you basically a bunch of short codes that allow you to push the content to the browser more efficiently, and then as a result of that is actually generating the HTML for you. So you set up more of the rough framework than you do like the nitty-gritty of the output code. They do a little comparison here between using Razor versus traditional ASPX. And I do want to mention here that this .NET environment has been evolving, but basically how the whole .NET field works is we started out with the scripting language straight ASP. And those would be files that had just an ASP file extension, and that's where we use the ASP style tags with the %sign inside of brackets to indicate that we're running ASP code intermingled with our regular HTML. From there, you guys learned in our first .NET course that we had this ASPX language where we could run C# code on the back end and then combine it with the code and kind of marry the two together. And we did learn how to create like master pages and then push content into those structures. So we had back-end code working with that technology. And then, of course, the file extension is ASPX. Now, what we're doing here is really kind of a combination of the two, because Razor is really its own type of language. But it does have, as he indicates here, it's very similar to how ASPX works, which can have plain text in the mix, and you can have C# code right in there that works. Typically, the C# code will still be on the back end as our like true programming language. So Razor is not an attempt to replace that or to do the stuff that old ASP did. What its intent is basically to give you a simpler way to accomplish it, to learn basically a simpler syntax to accomplish some of the same tasks that you might do, especially the repetitive ones. All right. Let's move on here. Notice, of course, the author says, Microsoft wanted Razor to be easy to use and easy to learn. And then some of you might say, and I'm kind of one of those people, it's like, wow, now I got to learn something else to throw into the mix. And you know what? Here's my response to that. Get over it. That's just how it goes, It is really intended to make your life easier, so. All of this stuff really is only going to operate for us if, and only if, we do have a .NET underlayment to all our applications, that common application runtime library that makes all of the .NET possible. Now you got to remember, when you're running this stuff on a Windows server that is a web server, that once this code runs and is compiled, and it's running from an executable rather than from building the code each time, it will actually run significantly faster than what we're doing here in this environment. So when you actually get to the point where you start deploying these applications out in the field on Windows Server, there's a process that you use to take the application from just your code that you have here in Visual Studio, and then build it as an application right into the web server, and then basically it becomes part of your web server. So if you think of it that way, it's kind of cool. All right, let's take a look at some of the syntax here. And what's kind of fascinating is, a lot of the students that are taking this particular .NET 2 class are also taking the Java Programming 2 class, and there's a lot of parallels happening right now, and one of them is the fact that in the Java 2 class we are looking at the JSP technology, and we were just doing building loops in that technology tonight. So here we look at an example from a traditional ASPX file where you notice that we are interspersing basically C# code inside of ASP tags and intermingling it with our HTML, which you can totally do. And then anytime we need to run actual code that's not HTML, we have to throw in those delimiters. So that's why you see the percent signs in there. And then depending on whether or not we are running directives that either are outputting to the browser or they're just directives straight up like Java code that doesn't do any output or interact with data or anything like that, we use the straight percent sign. But if it is doing output and interacting, then we start changing the ASP tags. And I want you to notice here that with these HTML helpers that we have loaded up, that there's a colon after the percent sign, which is required to make certain things work. So sometimes a real common thing is if you're hand coding, those are little things that you kind of overlook and struggle to find. Visual Studio is pretty good about IntelliSensing that and then giving you debug actions that fix it. But notice the simplicity of this, really, of the intermingling with the code. So is this approach a bad one? No. Can you still use it? Absolutely. But this is what we are considering the older approach. Now, what they didn't like about that, and the reason they switched to a razor syntax, and that's why we're going to do a comparison here, is they're saying, well, gosh, if the code gets complicated and you're running C# code, and then all of a sudden you forget to put in a curly bracket or a semicolon that's on the other side of a piece of HTML code, it really screws you up. And here I am writing a bracket percent sign just to put a semicolon in there or a bracket in. It's really kind of irritating. So they came up with the razor syntax that is very, very similar to what we saw above, but notice they just put an @ sign in front of it, and it takes care of all those ASP style tags. So folks, it is cleaner. It is easier to use. So the transition, if you're a old school ASPX guy moving into the razor format, the transition is actually a pretty easy one once you see the correlations. And really, the only difference is removing some of those unnecessary tags and putting in the @ sign here. All right. And really, all that does is it just triggers within the compilers and the rendering engines that, hey, this is a razor directive, we're handling this different. It really is telling you that we're running back-end code here on the server. All right, and I think the author is basically just kind of repeating. Now, he's going to have us, okay, so I'm sorry for that fumble here in the video, but I just had a question I want to go back and answer. So right up here, so take a look at the fact that if you look at the old code, that there is a pipe in here. And what is that? What would you think that is? Yeah, you're thinking that it's some sort of fancy directive. Really all it is they're putting 3 links in a row and they're separating it with a pipe. So they're basically creating a vertical line. It's just text, right? They could put a non-breaking space in there for all we care, right? So they're just separating things. So if you had a question, and then why is it here like this? It's just text. All right, so not a bad question. Sometimes it's those little things that kind of drive you crazy on trying to figure this stuff out. And then you get that little clue, and it's oh, aha, okay, it's not that big a deal at all. All right. So we're on now to page, let's see, 165 right up at the top. and he has us performing some steps here. So let me move this off to the second screen as is usual, and let's start to code this out and follow the steps. They do want us to create a new ASP MVC project, so let's do that. You know, if you've been doing nothing but this, of course, it'll take you right to that screen. Make sure you choose the .NET framework using Visual Studio 2017. We've been talking about that core, those core libraries, that those are the cross-platform ones, which I think we're going to see grow in prominence over the upcoming years as Microsoft really tries to break out of being a Windows-only kind of company, I think. But choose the .NET framework. The name they want us to apply here is MVC Razor Demo. Okay. Put it wherever it is you put it. I do not want it on my local drive here. I want it out in my cloud drive, and I've been putting it out in OneDrive myself. Oh gosh, where are we putting it this time? All right, let's create a new folder. I'm just going to do Razor Demo or something like that, just so I can find it easily. And we're selecting that folder. And then click OK. And we come up to the second screen where we select some of the stuff. They do want us to keep it empty at this point, but add folders and core references for MVC. We're not worried about authentication at this point. So just go ahead and click OK. All right, and as it takes its sweet time to create it. Now we're going to move on to the next instruction, which is at the bottom of 166. And he makes the point that since we really didn't like pre-build, like bootstrap into it and all that stuff, we're starting with an empty project. We need to add a controller so at least we can, have something to launch to. So we do need to build a home controller. So on your controllers folder, go ahead and do a right click and choose Add, and then choose Controller. They do want us to choose an empty controller at this point. Let's click Add. And then they do want us to call it Home, which is a real common name for a home page, of course. All right, and we'll give this a moment to do the scaffolding and build out the files. And then it drops us onto a fresh C# file ready for some code. Now moving on down to page 168, they ask us to right-click the index action result. So right on top of the method, just right-click and click Add View. So we're putting in the controller, and because there's an action method here, we can then build something to look at with it. We'll stick with the name index. We don't have any models in here that we can build from, so that's going to stay the way it is. And then once you got all those things in position, and I'm noticing we want to actually uncheck the use a layout page, because if you look at the bottom of 168, you see that he's got that unchecked. All right. Go ahead and click Add. And then it builds our index CS HTML page. And then you notice that the controllers then do match up with things in the views folder. So the home controller has a folder of its own in the views folder because we just created it. And then there's the default index view, which we just chose to create. The author does make note here that if you happen to be using Visual Basic as your backend language, and you can create these MVC applications using Visual Basic, file extension will be different. But C# really is Microsoft's language of preference, and there's no reason not to use it at this point in time. All right. They're making the point now that if we go ahead and run this, and you know what, let's go ahead and run it. We don't have anything on the page, right? So the browser should come back empty. Once it loads up, you can see the server in the background is running. And there is our blank page. Want to give it a right-click view source, not a bad thing to do. Doesn't mean there's no code there, but we didn't add any code, so why would it display any code? He does make a little bit of a point about this layout equals null, because we don't have a pre-configured layout that we're pushing stuff into. It's not using a template of any sort. And that's one technique that you can kind of ramp up as you get better with this technology. All right, so at this point he wants us to go ahead and start adding some code. So what we're going to do is, using Razor syntax, we're going to add a for loop in here. Go ahead and hit the stop button so we can start to code. And I'm going to do this in pieces. It's not a very complicated loop. So create a new line, put in the Razor directive, and you see how it highlights yellow because it tells you you're running Razor right there. And then you can add in a for statement. And what they're doing is they're setting up a counter here. They're calling it index, set to 0. And we're going to run this loop while index is less than 12. And then we will increment index using kind of a standard technique. Then go ahead and add your curly brackets. And then inside here, we're going to add a div. And inside the div, we're going to add another Razor directive and then index. Now, for those of you that were just doing the Java stuff just before we came into this class, because that's kind of how it's running here, and we were writing those ASP-style delimiters with the percent signs and remembering to close them, can you see immediately how this is easier? Just out of practicality. All right. And really all we're going to do here is what? We're basically just taking this variable and populating it straight into this loop. So very simple. We're just pulling a variable in and outputting it. We're putting it into a div, so it'll output as a block, so it'll be on a fresh line each time. Go ahead, save your work and give it a run. And then you should basically, if you think about what this is doing, it's going to count from 0 to 11. It should. And output it to the screen. Nothing fancy. You want to do a right-click, view source, do that, see the code. Do you notice also how the output of this code is nice and clean? Where when we were working with other backend languages, I'm picking on Java right now, but in order to make the code look clean in the output, you'd have to actually manually go in and tell it to print on a new line to make it print on a new line. You don't have to do that here. So I like that approach to it. It's really pretty simplistic and effective, I think. All right, and that actually completes the chapter, folks. If you got this far, you got this to work. It's just a really simple demonstration of how Razor works. It's not intended to teach you the whole of it. You can use your other textbook if you want a more in-depth overview of the kind of stuff you can do. And then it's really kind of up to your creativity when it comes down to it to come up with things to do with this technology. All right, this video ends here, and I'll see you in the next section, which will be section 20.